All right, so hi everyone, so my name is Remi. I'll be presenting my own paper. Make sure to check the time. All right, so okay, so I'm going to present this paper on estimating the spillover effect of foreign conflict with some evidence from Boko Haram. I have three co-authors on these papers, Brian, Taka, and Carlos. Carlos and Taka, the other two organizers of the conference. All right, so what we do in this paper, we focus on the effects of Boko Haram that started in 2009 in northeastern Nigeria. But until 2014, Boko Haram concentrated its terrorist activities in Nigeria and did not enter Cameroon, Chad, or Niger. So we use that as a natural experiment to study the economic spillover effect of conflict. But here we're looking at foreign conflict. So what is the effect of Boko Haram in Cameroon, Chad, and Niger where you don't have conflict, Boko Haram conflict in Cameroon, Chad, and Niger? So we're going to do a simple difference and difference analysis. And we're going to find large negative effects. We're going to find heterogeneous local effects. So some places are going to be really impacted, other places are not going to be as impacted. And it's going to allow us to examine the factors of economic resilience to foreign conflict shocks. All right, so the policy question here is that many border regions in the world are likely impacted by the cross-border economic effect of insurgencies or state failures in neighboring countries. So you can think of bad neighbors, and there are a lot of examples in Africa. The questions here is like, what is the magnitude of a spillover effect of foreign conflict? What are the channels for which they operate? And what policies can government adopt in the potentially exposed regions to mitigate such spillover effects? Okay, so if you're like close to Venezuela, what do you do in your border regions? If you're close to the Central African Republic, what do you do in your border regions? In terms of literature, there are three literatures here, one on the spillover effect of conflict, one on which policies we need to adopt in conflict countries. But here in this case, we focus on like border regions in the non-conflict countries. And then there's also this literature on the local economic effect of conflict. Here we focus on foreign conflict, and we focus a bit more on trade as well. And a lot of people attending the conference today have contributed to these literatures. Right. So let me start with Boko Haram. Boko Haram was founded in 2002, became more radical over time. In 2009, the government decided to act and arrest a few members. It leads to the insurrection. We argue in a paper the timing was exogenous in the sense that it could have been any time before or after. People were surprised it took 7 years for the government of Nigeria to do anything. But when the government of Nigeria finally did something, people were surprised as well. And then what's important here is that by 2013, Boko Haram controlled 7% of the population of Nigeria. And at the time, Boko Haram was the world's deadliest terrorist groups, ahead of ISIL and the Taliban. The other thing as well is that the Boko Haram area is wealthier than the corresponding areas in Niger, Chad, and Cameroon. If anything, the Boko Haram area is like 50% of nightlights in the Lake Chad region. So when this region is becoming darker, you can think of this as a massive economic shock or trade shock for areas in Cameroon, Chad, and Niger. So we're going to focus on three countries of study, and we're going to use the fact that until 2014, Boko Haram did not enter these areas. So we only have like an economic or trade shock. We don't have a conflict shock. So our main analysis, we're going to use sales of 0.1 times 0.1 grid cells in the three countries. On the left-hand side, we're going to have these measures of nightlight intensity. The series stops in 2013. We're going to focus on the main urban sample of 15,000 cells, where it's light at one point, so these are like more urban cells. And then we're going to have, so on the left-hand side, we're going to have these measures of nightlights, not top-coded in our data. We're going to use this as a proxy for local economic development. On the right-hand side, we're going to have a very simple measure like of distance to Boko Haram area. So this is a Boko Haram area. We have some details on that in the paper. And we're going to have this distance to the Boko Haram area. So we expect like stronger effect if you're like closer versus farther away. So it's like difference in difference. The first thing is to see like, where do you get the effect? So this is a panel DID for cell S in countries near T. On the left-hand side, you can have this like nightlight measure. And on the right-hand side, you can have this like distance dummies. Are you like 25 kilometer, 50 kilometer, 75 kilometer, etc. from the Boko Haram area? And we're going to have a post 2009 dummy, which is like, okay, the conflict has started. And then we're interested in this coefficient. So here we have like self-fixed effect, contributor fixed effect, different controls. And what we see is that the effect is very strong, like close to the border. So it's like around -15, -20. So it's like -15%. Night lights are like lower. And then the effect disappears after 200 kilometers. So this is more or less like the geographical scope of the effect. And then in the rest of the analysis, for sake of simplicity, we're going to use a simple dummy, like are you between like 0 and 200 kilometer? So we can do the next analysis, which is like, okay, we have this dummy, like are you within 200 kilometer? We're going to interact that with here fixed effect. And what it allows us to do is to check for parallel trend that indeed, well, before Boko Haram started, you have no effect more or less. Once you get Boko Haram, you see this very negative effect in these border regions. And by 2013, the end of a period, we get an effect of -20%. So it's a very big effect. And again, like Boko Haram did not enter these countries at the time, so it's not a direct effect of Boko Haram, it's an indirect effect. All right. So then we look at the long-term effect as well. So a lot of people have used this DMSP data, but there is this new data set called VIIRS. The problem between DMSP and VIIRS is that you have comparability issues. So that's why the precision is much lower. But the good thing that we can use this data to look at night lights of a period of like, up to 2018. And then we can look at a long-term effect. A long-term effect are even bigger. So really, like we're looking at the beginning, but if we're looking at long-term, we'll have even stronger effects. Right. So then we investigate the mechanism. We want to know like why conflict in Nigeria can have an impact on Cameroon, Chad, and Niger, although Boko Haram has not entered these countries. So what is a different mechanism here? We found that urban areas were disproportionately impacted. When you use a night light, the effects are driven by the intensive margin. The cells where you already had lights before. So the question like, is the cell becoming more urban or less urban as a result of Boko Haram? And then we use the extensive margin, which is like, okay, you didn't have lights before. What is the probability you get lights? So this is about like a village or small town becoming a bigger town. So this is more like about rural economic development, and we don't see any effect there. And we use different outcomes that have been used in other papers like greenness, land use, and actual burning. They come from satellite data. Actual burning is like they have data on fires, where fires that are done by farmers to prepare the land at the end of the harvest season. And we find very weak effect here. So that's why we argue that this is really an urban shock. Okay. Then if it's an urban shock, like what do you have this effect in cities? Is it due to curfews? No, there were no curfews at the time. Is it due to refugees coming from Nigeria to the cities and any of negative impact of that? We don't find that this is the case. Could it be that people were really afraid of Boko Haram? Like, although Boko Haram was in a neighboring country, and as a result, they left. So Boko Haram had no impact on income, but people were scared, people leave. We do some of this analysis. We don't find that you have out migration. Actually, what's interesting is people are fearful, but they expected the shock to be temporary. The first 5 years, they're like, okay, the government of Nigeria is going to do something. Its international allies are going to do something. And so people were not leaving, people were staying, but income kept declining. What's important for us also is that we don't find any spillover effect of conflict. You have no effect on local non-Boko Haram conflict. So we use three databases. We use Uppsala, we use ACLED, and we use a SCAD. So the first two data sets measure more like armed conflict. The last one focuses on social conflict. We don't find the effect, which is to some extent strange because you get this massive income effect. But at the same time, you can explain it from the fact that this is an urban shock that is really affecting the trading sector. And so in that case, incentives for people in these areas may not to be engaged in conflict. And so there's some studies discussing the impact of trade on conflict and saying that in that case, if that's that type of shock, we may not expect poverty or income shock to necessarily lead to conflict. And finally, our main explanation that, well, there must be this trade disruption because you have all this income in the Boko Haram area, the region is becoming darker, so you have less trade overall in the area. The other thing as well, the Boko Haram areas serve as a trade corridor between Cameroon and Chad on the one side and Niger on the other side. So then they cannot trade anymore, they have to go all the way around the Boko Haram area. We still need to do work more on that, but hopefully we'll get some more results in the future. All right, we'll skip that in the interest of time. Right, last part of the paper is to try to study where you get these effects. So we get this effect of minus 20%, but what we see is that some places were really impacted. So you see an effect of like minus 10%, or some of the other places were much more impacted. So what we can do, we can use this analysis to study the factor of resilience for conflict shocks. And when we say resilience here, we mean both mitigation. So you have this like negative income shock. Are you able to mitigate the shock like right away? And then the question, like after 5 years, are you able to adapt? So this is the same thing with climate change. Like we want to know about like mitigation versus adaptation. So we're going to do a triple difference, very similar to a previous paper, where we're going to look at our main treatment, which is the interaction of Boko Haram times the post-2009 dummy. But we're going to interact that with a dummy if you have a specific factor in a cell. For the time being, we'll just do it one at a time. So what we see here is this is a dummy if the cell was more developed. So if the measure of night lights in the cell was above the 90th percentile value of night lights in the country in 2008, so before Boko Haram. And in that case, you see an effect that is like 0.2, what it means like you have a lot of resilience for places that are more developed. And for places that were less developed initially, you see a more negative effect. So what it means like when you get a Boko Haram shock, places that are more developed before the shock are more able to cushion the shock. Places that were less developed initially, so the least developed urban locations, were less able to absorb the shock, and so they decline more. And so you have an increase in spatial inequality with this foreign conflict shock. We think of these like more like agglomeration forces, but then we're going to look at other different factors. One of them is market potential. So here you get this shock where you lose access to Boko Haram area, which was very important economically for these other countries. But then the question, like if you're within Niger and you're more connected to other places in Niger, so if you have a more diversified set of trade partners, you may be better able to cushion the shock from loss of Boko Haram trade. And this is what we find here is that places that are really well connected to other places in their own country are able to cushion the shock, but places that are more remote, places that are less connected to other places in the country, you see a much more negative effect here. Then we look at like, do you have a market? Do you have a paved road? Do you have access to electricity? Like a main power line? We look at social services like hospitals, higher education. We see this effect for paramilitary forces headquarters, which is, we think, important here in this context. Like people were not so afraid that they were leaving the region, but people were still afraid that there was a risk that Boko Haram will come in at the time. And we find this got stronger resilience effect for these more secure places. So we think that maybe people, like maybe entrepreneurs, were more likely to make investments because they thought that the location would be safer in the longer run. And likewise, we see this nice gradient where you see this very strong effect for like paramilitary forces, but you see weaker effect for like second level administrative capitals where probably you just have a police, but you don't have a military. All right. So we tried 50 different factors and we aggregate these factors into like different sectors. So we think of agglomeration forces, trade diversification, infrastructure, agricultural and industrial development, social services, and security. And then from that, we create 6 indices capturing different types of resilience factors. And then we can study the effects of these indices one at a time or simultaneously. When you have 50 factors, you cannot include the 50 interactions at the same time, it's just too much. With these indices, we can try to interact all of them at the same time to see if they matter independently. So this is effect for 6 indices, first one at a time, and I'm going to show you simultaneously. So this is the question is like, how do we define these dummies? So here it's like it's a dummy if you have very high value of the agglomeration forces or trade diversification or infrastructure. And the 10th dummy, percentile dummy is here. So if you have a very low value of these agglomeration forces, trade diversification. What we see a very strong effect of the agglomeration forces. We see a very strong effect of a trade diversification, and we see some effect of infrastructure, social services, and security. And for places that have less of these, we also see very negative effects. This is if we focus more like extreme locations. We can focus on like less extreme location by having like 75th and 25th percentile dummies. So then the effects are more or less the same. Some of the effect decrease, some of the effect increase. So like here, the trade diversification is very important for the places doing a lot of trade, but less so if you include places where the trade is less important. And security is important here, but if you look at more broadly, like all the places close, not so close, but like in the region of these paramilitary forces headquarters, you see the effect increase. We discussed why the effect change based on the dummies in the paper, but what we do next is like we try all of them together. So we have like 12 interactions at the same time. That may be too much, but and as a result of that, it becomes less precise. But that's why we focus more on the point estimates, and we focus more on the point estimate. We see strong effect for aggregation forces. The trade diversification has a strong effect as well, which is not significant. We see an effect for places that are less connected to other places in our own country. This is if we use a 19th and 10th percentile dummies. If we use 75 and 25 percentile dummies, we find the strong effect of aggregation forces, and then the security becomes significant in this case. So let me conclude here. We find strong negative effects, economic effect of a foreign conflict shock. The most likely channel in our mind is like you have reduced trade from the Boko Haram area or through the Boko Haram area. You have an increase in uncertainty in the urban areas. However, more evidence is needed, so we're working on that right now. Despite this massive decrease in income, we find no effect on local conflict. Our explanation of the shock was more likely urban. So that was different from a lot of shocks. So I've been exploiting the literature where they focus more like on weather shocks, more in like rural areas. And lastly, we focus on these factors of resilience. We see that trade diversification and security matter. So we argue that government investment can help regions bordering foreign conflict areas. However, since aggregation forces matter as well, you should expect an increase in spatial inequality within this region, with some places doing better and some places collapsing entirely. All right, so I'm done. Thank you so much. Let me, so the discussant is going to be Matthieu Couttenier from the University of Lyon, ENS. And I think I gained some time, so we have more time for a discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot for the invitation, and thanks, Remy, for the paper. So it was a real pleasure to read the paper and also to have your presentation, especially because I guess this is a very important question when you try to estimate the actual cost of violence, and especially, you know, when you try to estimate the aggregate impact of violence and aiming to quantify the counterfactual policy intervention. And that's why so I have a couple of comments. I just speak about three given the time constraint, so I'm happy to speak about it later on. But the first comment is really related to the measure of the actual cost of violence, because basically, as you said during your presentation, the effect is sizable, and as you said, it's, you know, an effect that is sizable given that the fact this is a kind of indirect exposure, indirect measure of violence, and given the different estimates, it's range from 7 to 15%, and when you look at the alternative data set, it could go from 20 to 50. So my point here is basically that I'm wondering whether it can be a kind of overestimation. And especially when you look at your effect on violence, for sure you motivate the fact that you don't find evidence on violence because it's mainly driven, and the cost mainly driven because it occurs in urban areas. But still, I'm wondering whether it could be also a kind of a signal that if there is no opportunity cost mechanism at play, it would be a signal that there is probably an overestimation. And especially we'll have some interest having some results on riots or protests in urban areas, whether you can identify something. So just two ideas on why probably it could be a kind of overestimation. The first one is about your left-hand side variable. So as you said, it takes the log of 1 plus the 9-time data, and probably it has to be, in terms of estimation, probably better using the inverse hyperbolic linear transformation that would probably lead to a lower estimate. And my second point is related to the estimates from 2009 to 2012. This is a graph you've shown at some point where basically, for me, at least for the reading of the figures, it's not very clear that the year 29 to 2012 are very different from just the year before 2009. And for me, most of the effect is concentrated in 2012 or 13, where of course you have 20% of differences in relative to 2000. But basically, as you are looking at nighttime luminosity, there is a kind of a cumulative effect. So probably this is, I don't know whether the reading is right or not, but probably this is a 20% differences in terms of activities over the 4 or 5 years after the start of the conflict. And the other one is whether we may observe some increase of violence in the Niger, Chad, and Cameroon regions from other groups. If we think about a kind of competition mechanism, there is the rise of violence from Boko Haram, and you may imagine that some groups that were already in place in the regions will also have more fighting activities, and that may explain potentially the large magnitude you find in your estimates. So my second comment is related to something that we're relatively quick on the presentation, and the fact that you have some very fascinating, I guess, evidence, at least for me, on the increase of the agricultural burning. And the way you phrase it in the paper is very fascinating, because you say that farmers with this activity are willing to increase the short-term incomes at the expense of future incomes. So basically what you observe is that there is a kind of bias, a present bias, that is taking place in face of this shock. And I think that this is something that is very important, especially again when we think about the real actual cost of violence. And I think it would be useful to complement the analysis with some alternative data where you have more precise information about the productivity or the production, like with LSMS or GHS data. And then my last comment is related to the definition you have of the Boko Haram area and about the adjacent cells. My understanding of your results is that basically what is very important, this is both the location of the activity of Boko Haram, but also the timing of the events. And I guess these two informations are very crucial. So for now, what you're taking into account, this is, let's say, a raw measure of distance between this area and the other cells. But I think that probably you may have some interest in this very interesting paper of Tapsoba in 2020, the job market paper, where he tried to modelize a bit more violence with the space-time stochastic process. And this is something that I guess could be very useful, because whole the point of the measure is to take into account this the question of fear and uncertainty that is, I guess, also a mechanism that is very important in your story. And I think it would represent an alternative measure of of distance, and which probably the timing of violence, where it's taking place, given the months of the year, and so on, would be something very useful. So I don't know. I guess I'm already out of time. So I have different other probably more minor comments, but I'm happy to chat about it later on. So thanks a lot, Remi, for this great job.
Great, thank you, Matthieu. If you can send me the slides. And so I'm the moderator as well. So if you have any comments from the panelists, you can unmute yourself. I didn't see any comment in the chat box, so okay, people are shy today. All right, so in any case, I just answer Matthieu's comment. Yeah, I like the, like we have these different data sets. We have like ACLED, Uppsala, and SCAD. I like the SCAD data set because it's really focusing on social conflict. And I think we look at measures of riots and protest, maybe in the appendix something, and we didn't find any result. I don't know how much of this SCAD data set is well measured. I know other papers have looked at food prices and urban riots in Africa. I think was it? I forgot the name. But yeah, I'm kind of worried about measurement error, and I don't know if people have experience with this other database of SCAD. And then you asked this very good question about the fear of exposure. It's true that people really, uncertainty will increase, and this is related to Chris' presentation. I think this is what's happening in cities. We don't have quantitative evidence, and we want to work on that. We're trying to, we're thinking of using firm level data, but there are very few formal firms in these areas. The problem, you also don't have census. The census in Niger was 2012. These are countries that haven't been in census in like 15 years, so what do you do? And likewise with DHS and the LSMS are really not great in these areas. Typically, they're good in the cities. So we really don't have much data. This result on nitro burning, yeah, we found that people are more likely to use to burn the land, which is a way you can increase income in the short run at the expense of a long run. But the result is kind of smaller than for urban areas. And we think that, if people didn't have good jobs in the cities because the trading sector is collapsing, maybe they're more likely to move to rural areas to try to increase their income on the side and something. And lastly, I forgot to say, we're working on this conflict market access measure now. We wanted the most simple measure of exposure to the shock, but now we want a more refined measure where it's going to be through the world network, why you connected to specific conflict events in the other areas. These measures are great, but they're also sometimes mismeasured. And so it can also lead to downward bias if so. There's a trade-off. A simple measure is nice, but a more precise measure is nice as well. But there's always a risk of mismeasurement. So we're still struggling a bit to see what the result mean with this other measure. But you're right. If it is about trade, it should go through the broad network, and it should be about connection to the main cities in Nigeria. So that's what we're trying to do now.